All right, and here we are with Miguel Conner. Miguel, great to have you back on the show. The folks know who you are thanks to the introduction they just heard, post-edited in. But you've been working on a really incredible project. I've heard a little bit about it on your awesome podcast, Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. Of course, folks can go and check out the God Above God.com to find out more about that. I'm also a Patreon subscriber, so I highly recommend people support Aeon Byte and get the extra content there. But I've been hearing, here and there, your research about Elvis. So let's get into it. First of all, how are you today? And second of all, tell us how you came across Elvis and how this became a part of what you've been researching, because you've been writing a lot.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. As always, cool to be on your podcast and welcome to your nightmare, as the song goes, but I do like your dream. Well, the truth is all my life, I never really liked Elvis at all. That's the thing where sometimes you are called, and like Jonah, you get thrown in the belly of the whale or the big fish. And all my life I think part of the book starts out with, there's a scene in Pulp Fiction where Mia is telling Vincent Vega, John Travolta, and the Uma Thurman character, before they go on their ill-fated date. And she says, there's only two types of people in this world, and those are Elvis people and Beatles people. And who you are says a lot about you. And I always thought I was a Beatles guy. And all my life, I thought Elvis was just basically the musical equivalent of Big Mac or Mountain Dew. And he represented the excesses and shallowness and consumerism of American culture. And boy, was I so wrong, so completely wrong. I mean, as time went by, you get older, you start listening to history, you appreciate the past, you go, okay, this guy was really a foundation of not just pop culture, but really American culture. He was a legend. He directly influenced people like John Lennon and David Bowie, The Clash, Elton John. I mean, over and over again, he woke so many people up to this sort of to this rock and roll. But then I appreciated him. I remember reading a book in 2014 and having the writer Gary Tillery on the show, and he talked about, his book does mention some of Elvis's occult leanings. And it was just, I just filed it under, there's some, rock stars were into weird things, right? Jimmy Page was into Thelema. David Bowie was into Gnosticism, the usual stuff. The Rolling Stones were into Satanism for a while. It's just what they do. But then last summer, and remember, I still didn't know anything about Elvis, one biography, and that was it. Didn't really care for his music. I did ayahuasca, the very intense sessions in Portugal with Santo Daime Church, and suddenly he was in my head, and I could not shake Elvis Presley. I watched the biopic, but again, that's it. One biography, and I watched the Elvis movie, and suddenly he was everywhere. Just not synchronicities, but just in my head, things kept coming up. And last fall, I remember dressing up like Elvis in Halloween. I never dress up for Halloween. I went for like 2 months where I could not stop listening to his music in the car while working out. It's just like this uncontrollable urge and dreams. And I was like, oh my God. And so last February, suddenly I just said, okay, I surrender. I'm going to write a biography about Elvis. And with no knowledge, I just sat down there on a cold evening, and I started just writing this biography, and everything came out. And this last August, a big publisher has accepted the book. I recently came back from Memphis to turn in photographs and extra research, and the book should be out in about a year. And people are going, well, what's this book? Well, this book right now is tentatively called America's Magician, and my claim is that Elvis Presley is, among many things, the greatest occultist, magician, and shaman of Western culture. bar none. I mean, whether you think Crowley, Rudolph Steiner, John Dee, they were just amateurs compared to him. And I look forward to the debates, just like I look forward to debating Elvis fans, because as you know from your family, they are, yeah, they're pretty orthodox. They're pretty fundamentalist when it comes to Elvis, but they're wrong about everything. He was a man that was deeply steeped in occultism. He was a devotee of Madame Blavatsky, Yogananda, Manly P. Hall. He was a almost scholar. He was so well read. Whenever he'd go on tour or anywhere he went, Vegas, Hawaii, he always had a group of workers that would carry 200 occult books, and he would just consume them. He was so into occultism. He was a natural magician. He could manipulate weather, he could manipulate matter. He was a mystic. He could leave his body, read minds. He had prophetic abilities. He was a natural healer. He could heal people in insane ways, and that are out of this world. He had several extraterrestrial encounters. I mean, not only was he an occultist, but he was kind of like you and I. He was a high weirdness, red pilled pseudo truther. You know what I mean? He was into the whole conspiracy theory in the 60s. He didn't. He thought immediately that JFK had there was not one gunman who killed him. He thought Bruce Lee had been assassinated. He thought the Vatican was hiding secrets. He thought the U.S. government was hiding aliens. I mean, he was way ahead of the curve when it comes to conspirituality, if you would. And the book goes even other things, showing how he was America's shaman, how he basically created modern American culture. How, if we want to save this country, we really need to go back to Elvis, because he does represent both what's hideous and uh, holy about American culture. There is such a thing as the American psyche, and we've lost it. I compare him to Philip K. Dick, because both have some striking parallels, and both influence really changed the world. And that's it. And I know I just went on a tangent, but I just get excited about America's Magician.
No, you set us up great for our conversation because, yeah, I've heard a little bit about the book from previous interviews you've done. And honestly, when, Elvis came to mind from the conspiracy podcast perspective, the first thing that I can really think of hearing Elvis in this context is like faking his death and the sightings afterwards, and that may be what people expect when they see Elvis in the title of this episode. But I was so stunned and really impressed with the detail that you shared about Elvis's mystical side. So I did a little digging. I have some notes that maybe you've come across this information, but I want to talk about Elvis's birthplace and where the story begins, because there's some weird things about Elvis's birth that I think a lot of people might not know. I certainly didn't know it, but one thing that I found out is in Tupelo, Mississippi, where he was born. The Natchez Trace runs through there, and this is a ancient path, right? Native American tribes have been going up and down it. The early settlers of the area called this path the Devil's Backbone. And another interesting point is on the Devil's Backbone, there are the Phar mounds, and that's spelled like the way Pharaoh is spelled, Pharr, and those date back to AD 1 to 200, so they're far older than a lot of the other mounds that we see in the area, and it's kind of interesting, just in line with some of the things we talked about the last time you're on the show as far as like the synchromistic landscape goes. Elvis was certainly born in a possibly charged place, right? I mean, they say that the Phar mounds are some of the most important mounds of their age. So who knows if that played into his, early anomalous, birth. But before I spill the beans, please tell us, what went down when Elvis was born, and how did that play into the rest of his life?
Yeah, that's interesting too. I mean, yeah, I do deal with a little bit of the history of Tupelo. Now, I must say before I go forward, obviously Elvis was a a conspiracy theory industry long before. I mean, you remember when we were young, you'd see the tabloids. Elvis was an alien. I mean, it was all the time. There were many documentaries. There's books. I mean, it was huge in the 80s and 90s. And but my research is always avoid. I mention in his death sort of the sensationalistic books that have come out. But when it comes to him being a mystic and a magician, I go through the source. Basically, I go through everybody that was around him: Priscilla Presley, the Memphis Mafia, parents, friends. So everything I mentioned in the book is corroborated by many people who saw it and included them in their bios or stories. So I should say that. But the two things is we when Elvis was born, and he was born what, January 8, 1935, same day David Bowie was born. Um, this was the Great Depression, and it was a brutal time. Elvis was part of the generation that gets forgotten, like the Gen X generation has been forgotten. You've got the greatest generation, and then you've got the baby boomers, but people forget there's a generation in the middle called the silent generation. And that's the generation that they didn't go to war. They weren't adults during the Great Depression, but they were children. So they were really affected by this as children. On the other side, once the war ended in the 50s, they started becoming teenagers. So there's a mentality to this generation, if you want to talk about it in a little bit. But when Elvis was born, Tupelo was, as somebody wrote, the wrong side of the wrong side of the tracks. It was, I mean, we're talking, when I research it, this is like North Korea poverty in Mississippi in the Great Depression. It was bad. It didn't matter if you were white, black, or there were Lithuanian Jewish communities. It didn't matter, Irish. It was bad. And he was born in this grinding, destructive, soul suffocating poverty of Mississippi. When he was born at home because obviously his parents couldn't afford a doctor except to come later. They couldn't afford a hospital, a doctor to come later. Once he was coming out of the canal, they lived in a house had no indoor plumbing, no indoor heat. It was just on stilts, a small house that Elvis's dad built. And during the birth, it was a hard birth for his mother, Gladys. She was conceiving twins. And Vernon went outside to have a cigarette during this long labor, while Gladys was with two friends or relatives who were playing the part as helping her deliver it. And he saw a blue light. A blue light came and flooded the whole place. Everything went dark. The coyotes, the wind, everything went silent, and Vernon was like, just sat there and freaked out and just like ran in the house. But then as soon as he ran in the house, this terrible thing happened. And as he was running in the house, there was two little like dolls that they had, ceramic dolls, and one fell and broke. And when they went, Elvis, his brother Aaron was born first, and he died. He died. He was stillborn. He died. He was dead. And 35 minutes later, Elvis came out. And it was a huge tragedy. And they were so poor and freaked out. They actually put Elvis like in the oven under warm because they were freaking out. And eventually Gladys lost a lot of blood. The doctor came and said, you got to go to the hospital. She lost her ability to have children, but Elvis survived. And this was a huge crushing thing. It's like I always tell people ask, why was Elvis doomed? It's like he was doomed from the start. That because he lost his twin, and his research has shown there is something called a twinless survivor. Those who lose their twins are very close. When you lose a twin, you lose like half of your soul. It's the same when you lose a twin at childbirth, but you grow up with this horrible sense of guilt because Philip K. Dick lost his twin sister when he was born. And both Elvis and Phil had this, what you call survivor guilt. They were always wondering, why me? Why did my sibling died. As Philip K. Dick said when they asked him about his sister who died, he said, well, I guess I got all the milk. This sense of, horrible sense of guilt that something's wrong, that you're lost. And twinless survivors, whether it's Philip K. Dick, Elvis Presley, or Liberace, end up being, in a way, seekers, very philosophical, but they end up and very artistic, very driven, very flamboyant in how they express themselves, whether it's the writing or performance. But they also are very self-destructive. They lean towards drug addiction. They cannot have deep contact with other people because of the loss that they suffered, the trauma. And again, in those days, there was no therapy for this or the concept. So Elvis grew up kind of screwed all that way. And this brother, twin, just like with Philip K. Dick, became his daemon. Both would speak in their heads, both would guide them, they would have dreams and visions of this dead twin to help them out through the good times and bad times. But again, the weight of it eventually, you might say, eroded both Philip K. Dick and Elvis, which led to their destruction. That's one way. So losing his twin was a huge thing to most Elvis fans. Oh, he should have just gotten away with it. He was just a baby. It's like, no, you don't understand. It was it really shaped Elvis forever. It was like his both, and Philip K. Dick. It was their one driving thing was, why did I lose my twin? Where is my twin? And why do I feel so guilty that I need to self-medicate all the time? So, and as I mentioned, Mark, the poverty, as we're finding out from, Gabor Mate's book, The Myth of Normal, poverty is traumatic, and poverty is a trauma that gets passed down through generations. And Elvis growing up so dirt poor was also a trauma that really affected him and drove him for both good things and bad things. It became something that he became very, he made, in our days, billions of dollars, but he also threw it all away. He was a workaholic because he was always, there's part of you that doesn't want to be poor again. So you're driven and you're feeling guilty and you're wondering why I got rich, but it is a generational trauma. So those two things, just to begin with, both doomed and saved Elvis.
Yeah, that's incredible. That archetype of the twin is, one that's already rich with symbolism, but the, having one twin in the afterlife and one in the living, I'm sure opens up some sort of channel, a gateway, if you will. But the idea that Elvis, had this kind of mystical connection, I think really is more pronounced when he goes to Memphis, right? Because there was the whole hurricane or tornado in Tupelo that, he was miraculously spared, right? He was just a baby at the time, but hundreds of people died. It was one of the worst tornadoes in U.S. history. And
still the top 10, yes.
Yeah.
Still
well, and he was spared, and I don't know what circumstances led the family to go to Memphis, but clearly there was something that was meant to be there, because Memphis is, this kind of cultural epicenter with all this really interesting energy and the music scene and, just a nexus point, a melting pot, if you will.
No, Memphis obviously is from the Egyptian, I think the city that looks at two lands. In Egypt, it meant, it was a place that would divided upper and lower Egypt. And of course, Memphis also was this place where North and South met back in the 50s. And it was almost as mystical again as Egypt. And as I say, these Egyptian hermetic motifs in my book keep showing up. Well, Elvis, like, for example, most people don't know, he wore an ankh all the time. That was one of his symbols that he liked. And of course, he was fascinated with Egyptian mythology and other things. He died there's so many synchronicities. He died when he was 42, and 42 is an Egyptian holy number. It's the 42 negative sins that Mat will ask you out in the afterlife, or Osiris, 42 sins that you have not committed, and that's what's going to judge you in the end. There's so many, these weird Egyptian motifs keep coming up in Elvis's life. And even before Tupelo, they moved because it was poverty drove them. They knew Tennessee was a step up because, again, Elvis, from my book, he got this sort of second sight from his mother. His mother's family, and maybe it's Cherokee, maybe it was some sort of Jewish mystic thing. We don't know, but his mother would see visions. She would see demons at night, and she would see things that weren't there. She had that second sight, which Elvis was given. He got it, and she was really into Pentecostalism Christianity, which, as we're finding out, is just American shamanism, right? You get into an altered state of mind. Instead of Dionysus or Osiris taking over, you let the Holy Spirit, and these people are just like shaking and hitting each other, and you go into an altered state of consciousness. And she was so obsessed with going to church, even when she was pregnant with Elvis and Aaron, that's probably all they ever heard when they were in the belly, this constant drumming and guitar playing. Sometimes they'd have service out in the woods and they're screaming at the Holy Spirit and they're screaming in tongues. That kind of energy really affected him. But the problem too, Mark, is that when Elvis because of Aaron dying and his mother not being able to have children, she became very overzealous and overbearing with Elvis. And that right there, as we're finding, is, we call it helicopter parenting today, but in those days it's called lethal enmeshment, when your mother is so overprotective and makes the boy basically the husband or the main lover or love of the house. That becomes destructive, because children who grow up that way are always in this duality. They're either little children or they're like caretakers. And that was Elvis. He was either taking care of people or being destructive, shooting TVs and popping pills. But those people like that end up also with high addiction rates, bad in relationships, self-destructive, but they're also very artistic, very driven, and very mystical. So, and this abusive relationship they had also shaped Elvis. I mean, as a teenager, he would sleep in his bed with his parents, and they would make gooey eyes, and it was unfortunate. At one point, Elvis's dad got arrested and spent time in jail, and they were basically homeless. So it was just Elvis and his mother. So this, obviously, I mentioned about it earlier, but the poverty that just would not stop. And there were some nights all they had was water and cornbread. This is America, right? That's all they had to eat. That's how poor they were. Eventually, they went to Memphis because there were more opportunities, and things did get better as Elvis became a teenager.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, did Elvis have any signs of this kind of outside of his mother's, mystical sight? Did he have any signs of, this kind of knack for the mystical side of life at a young age, aside from maybe his budding musical talent?
Oh yeah, I mean, he obviously he would have visions. He was talking to his twin
Right.
all the time. He was a terrible sleepwalker. He was tormented by night terrors. But one thing that he did have, and he admitted it to a girlfriend when he was just breaking big, like he was 18, 19 or 20, he told a girlfriend he went out. They'd visited a friend at the hospital who had leukemia. They were sitting at the lake, and Elvis, one thing he would do is just stare out into space and just sort of blank out. And his girlfriend's like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "I can travel through the planets and the skies. I can leave my body and do it. The only person I'd tell is my mother, because if we say that, then our church is going to ostracize us in our community." But he was already admitting that there was these things he could do. And people always talk about, from even teenager, he had a way of reading people's minds. He knew what you were going to say. He knew exactly how you were feeling. He could read the room and understand what was going on. So he had that second sight, but it was only because of his background, because of the society he lived. It was only till his late 20s, 30s when he really broke into the occult that he really started flexing his muscle, if you know what I mean. But from all his life, he certainly had this ability, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So He was born in January, right? And I heard you mention that he was interested in astrology. Did that occur when he became like an initiate or a self-initiate, or did he know about, you know, that sort of thing when he was younger? Like, did that play into his persona at all?
No, again, he was stuck in, or he stayed in the Christian matrix, the fundamentalist Christian matrix, but some things happened that dislodged them from there. One was when he became famous, Christianity turned against him. We have to remember when Elvis hit it big. Like I say, Taylor Swift is uber famous. Elvis was uber famous, but he changed culture, and he was also uber hated. The establishment hated him with a passion.
Right.
Frank Sinatra was like, he's just a flash of, the old guard hated him. The government hated him because he was making women independent and sexually, curious. He changed culture in ways that single-handedly, you might say. So the Christianity changed it. His own pastor blasted him. Billy Graham said he was demonic, and he was completely hurt because he's like, I'm just trying to write some songs. I'm just trying to play some tunes. So that made him really angry at the church. But he always felt, well, the church has let me down. It's bullshit. At least I got Jesus, so I'll stick with it. But then when he went into the army, tragically, his mom died because they were separated. That's the great irony. I write how Elvis kind of made a deal with the devil with Robert Johnson, and we can talk about that. But he wanted to get rich to help his mother and father, but being separated from his mother, she couldn't take it, and she just collapsed. Her health went to shit. So he was heartbroken because in those days he was in the military, and it was like, oh, your mother died. All right, you get 2 weeks to grieve, and then you were shipping your ass to Germany. And he was just broken. He was a broken man because he was so close to his mother. So he began to search. Like he read, like, are you familiar with Khalil Gibran's The Prophet? When he was in Germany, he remembered that his girlfriend had read it, and it really saved him. He got into aromatherapy to help him with his stress and all that. But then he came back to the United States. He started doing karate in Germany and just sort of playing with things. But it was only when he came back and he started doing movies that he became really disillusioned with his life, because he was like, all right, I lost my mom. I've got more money than God. The whole world loves me. I'm already the GOAT, even though I'm alive. I mean, he's like Wayne Gretzky or Michael Jordan in the middle of their careers. They're already the best they ever was, and everybody knew it. It wasn't like even disputed. But he hated doing B movies. He wasn't satisfied with his music. He wasn't satisfied with his fame, and he met a hairdresser by pure luck, Larry Geller, who was really a mystic, and he was like, he was initiated into Yogananda. He was just a deep spiritual guy, and he was cutting Elvis's hair, and Elvis just turned around just out of nowhere. Said, "What are you into?" And the guy said all these things, and Elvis was like, "This is what I'm looking for." And he got Larry to bring him all these books, and he read them, and he was off to the races, because he realized, reading Theosophy and all that there was something called the Christ consciousness, and that Jesus was possibly one of many great souls in the world trying to help humanity. Like, Elvis suddenly believed, oh yeah, Zoroaster, Buddha, all these guys, and Jesus is one of them, and he could be part of it, like every human, to wake up to their Christ consciousness. Again, he read all these like mystic Christian books, like the Gospel of Thomas and some stuff by Manly P. Hall. So when he realized that Jesus didn't have to fit in Christianity, he was off to the races, and he began to study numerology. He studied astrology. He began to meditate. He began to do ceremonial magic. He just went crazy. And so for years, he became this just secret occultist, if you would. It wasn't secret because everybody hated it around him, because they knew that they were going to lose him. There were a couple of times when Elvis was like, fuck this. I'm going to go and be a monk. And in one time he wanted to be a Christian monk, another one he wanted to be a Buddhist, a Hindu monk, and he got talked out of it. But the Colonel and Priscilla and the Memphis, the whole industry that depended on him, they were not happy. Plus, he drove them crazy because there was the old Elvis with his entourage of 50 to 100 people. It's like, let's play flag football and ride motorcycles. And suddenly there was this Elvis like, we're all going to sit with candles and meditate and talk about our feelings and see what the spirits are doing. And they drove him crazy. But yeah, by the mid 60s or early 60s, before the hippies, before the Beatles, Elvis was like knee deep into mystic studies of all kinds.
Well, and that's partly why the show is named what it is. And it didn't really occur to me until, maybe a couple hundred episodes into the show. And my Norwegian friend Al kind of put some European sophistication behind it one day and was like, yeah, it is kind of a philosophical thing that you're describing, and it does seem like Elvis had that moment where the people around him thought he was kooky for opening up his mind and exploring these deeper things, which is, it's so interesting, especially when you understand like the etymology of celebrity and star and how, where that even comes from, that people like Elvis may just inherently be inclined to these things in that position. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I want to talk about this deal with the devil that you alluded to. And in my little research, asking my own personal silent generation and baby boomer generation in my family what they thought of Elvis, they said, my grandfather, he said that one thing that I should know is that when Elvis appeared on, I think he said the Dick Van Dyke Show. I don't remember which talk show he said.
Probably.
Yeah, Ed Sullivan, one of those, that they had to frame the camera above his waist because it was too salacious, too edgy to show below his hips. So if you consider that now in 2023 standards, where you have, all kinds of depravity just right there in front of you, click a button away, it is kind of interesting to think of him as this, ushering in this new wave of public ritual and occultism and through music. But what exactly happened in Memphis with this deal with the devil?
Well, like I talk in the book, I talk about Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson is considered history's first rock star, and there's of course the story that he did not play guitar or whatever, and he disappeared for a while. And when he showed up, he was this virtuoso who played this music that just blew everybody away. So there's of course in the blues community, they thought he'd gone to this place. I visited this place about a month ago in Mississippi where he met the devil and he made a deal with the devil for all this talent. And obviously he then later died. Nobody knows how he died. He might have been poisoned. It might have been some sexual transmitted disease, but he died pretty young, but he became a foundation for modern music. And he died at, as they say, at the crossroads. So this theme of the crossroads keeps coming up. And Robert Johnson died on August 16. Elvis died on August 16, I think, 30-something years later. And I talk about how Memphis was always considered the crossroads of the place. And the crossroads is always a place where the shaman and the trickster are. And this plays into the ideas of the blues because there are two forces that shaped Elvis. Elvis always said, I carry heaven and hell with me, and that's how I am in the middle of them. These are my two forces. People were like, what the hell is this dude talking about? Because two things influenced. One was the blues. Now, as I talk about Robert Johnson, the blues was really about the devil. Now, this is not, the Christian, your grandmother, Satan. This is more of a trickster being. It's almost an import from African tricksters or animist spirits that came to the United States. And then again in the blues, especially in the early 20th century, there's all these songs about deals with the devil's helping me out, or he's screaming. I mean, over and over. And of course, the blues is an expression about people that are oppressed, people that are homeless, people that are hurting in this new land. It really expresses, it's a continuation of Black folklore here in the United States. And this music became very huge for Elvis and everybody else, all the other, you know, parents of rock and roll. The other one, which people don't want to admit, and even Chris Knoll writes very well about it, but rock music is basically gospel music. It is Pentecostal music. And even when it came out, critics would go to rock concerts like, this is like a Holy Spirit tent revival. People shaking and they're, you know, going on altered states of mind and all that. And people were already saying that we're already angry at Pentecostals because they would say that Pentecostalism in the 50s was just mixing sex and salvation, which it was. Prince is a good one. Prince was always this kind of guy who was trying to reconcile sex and religion because he was a Jehovah's Witness. But that's what rock was. It was directly influenced by Pentecostalism and black and white gospel music. And this was really the foundation. So Elvis had the devil with the blues, and he had the angels with the gospel. Obviously, others very influenced by gospel and blues. We got Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, B.B. King, John, was it Lewis? Johnny Lewis, what was his name? Whatever. But this generation, the silent generation who basically gave us rock and roll, were so influenced by this shamanistic, altered state spirituality, blues and gospel that came together as rock and roll. And it was very magical, very about spirits and devils and all that. And it became rock and roll, which people said at the beginning was this sort of transgressive new form of spirituality. So, and the crossroads is always there. The devil's at the crossroads. So is the trickster. So this theme of the crossroads in Elvis's life and those early rock stars is always there throughout the book.
Right. And as you pointed out, Memphis is the veritable crossroads in this story, and Elvis plays this role that seems to be more trickster than devil. Not that the two can't be one and the same at some points, but they are separate in many ways. But
when he was the Lord of the Crossroads. I mean, you have to look at how America changed. I mean,
right.
Well, we can talk about it.
Well, I was going to ask if you could elaborate on the term that you described Elvis as, this American egregor, because I think it plays in really nicely with what you're just about to say.
Yeah, you have to look again at the silent generation and how much America changed. Right. After World War II, this generation that became teenagers came to a completely brand new world. This was the new, bright empire called the United States, Eisenhower's America. They came around and suddenly there was more money than God. And the older generations had no problem doting on them. As people have said, the word teenager didn't exist until the 50s, because this generation who'd fought in World War II and survived the Great Depression were like, we want to give our children everything we didn't want. They gave them all this money, and suddenly these teenagers had power. But not only were they confronted with all this money and wealth and brightness, they were also confronted with a world that had never seen this technology like before. Again, as Chris Knoll writes, you've got humanity sort of put. But Sumerians, okay, we went up. Okay, then 4,000 put. After the 1940s, it just shoots up like it's never before. Nobody can explain it. Of course, people explain it all the time, aliens, Nazis. I mean, but nobody really knows what happened. Suddenly, we had transistor radios, we had satellites, we had rockets, we had jukeboxes, all this technology was just exploding, and that shrunk the world and gave these teenagers a look at what the world was like never before. The problem is in this new braver world where the United States was suddenly, instead of a republic, was a mighty empire, there were threats. All of a sudden, the communists that were our allies are suddenly our mortal enemies. All of a sudden, there's nuclear bombs that could end civilization. All of a sudden, we have mass media that can see distant lands and people like the Chinese and the Koreans who might be a threat. All of a sudden, there's all these UFO sightings everywhere in Russia and the United States. So this generation was completely freaked out, and they became very kind of what you call stoic and pessimistic and Epicurean at the time. In other words, they said, shit, this world can end any time. The Reds could invade, the bombs could come, our great empire might collapse. At the same time, we've got all this money and stuff, so let's enjoy it. But what they started doing is they started opening up their minds to other cultures and histories and art forms. In other words, they started going for Black and Hispanic music. They started to be more accepting of Eastern traditions and so forth. And they became this new and Elvis, you might say, was a spearheaded guy. Not only to change the psyche, but with Elvis leading them, suddenly women decided that they wanted to be more liberated. I mean, he was like Dionysus, where he went, women's kundalini came up and women became more independent, more understanding of themselves. He could cause riots with women and everything. And he really changed the way the genders interacted, plus the way people wanted to listen to music. He came and he brought, as I say, the Lord of the Crossroads. We came into this old world of Frank Sinatra and all that, to this world where suddenly jazz and blues and black music and LA gang music was popular, and he mixed it all together. He came into this world where suddenly the civil rights appeared when Elvis was going. He was always at the crossroads of this great change from America to post-world America. And Elvis, might say, was the Pied Piper, the shaman, the trickster that led us, because the trickster is all about change and going into a new world, a new era. That's what a trickster, he guides us through the portals as a people and as a person. And Elvis was that person. And I talk about in the book, that suddenly had this American dream egregor, Eisenhower America, where different cultures could meet, where everybody had money and technology could help you. Highways could get us to places, and mass media could show us the world and history. And you had this massive egregor, and who represents that egregor? Elvis. He's like the Pied Piper, leading us to the best and worst of what America would become. Yes, we were a kind people. We became a multicultural, open-minded people, an artistic people, innovative, but we also became a people of excess, consumerism, materialism. So the good and the bad, that was Elvis when he came out in the 50s and 60s. He was the shaman that brought us. The shaman is a spiritual troubleshooter of the tribe. He's the one that heals the tribe and goes into the dark places, the crossroads, to bring spiritual and medical and psychological insights for the tribe. So he became America's shaman. He was the one that guided us through this new identity of the great American empire. Does that make sense? And again, it's all absolutely. Crossroads. It's all America, how it was before and how it became then. Right. He was the devil. He was the trickster.
Right. And 36 to 77, right? Or 35 to 77. I mean, that is the middle, most turbulent period of the last, 100 years, or the 20th century,
or the most change any civilization has gone through. Any civilization.
Yeah, and I wonder, the thought of history going in cycles has come to mind. I wonder if we're in a similar period now, leading into some sort of economic downturn that, who knows? I mean, I'm not hoping for a great war to come like it would have, 90 years ago, right? 80 years ago, somewhere around there. So, yeah, geez, I hope if we do, we at least get another really cool Elvis figure. But there has been talks that people like David Bowie maybe carried the torch for England, and that's kind of funny because I just watched Liquid Sky, which certainly seems to be inspired by David Bowie, but I was inspired to watch it because Chris Knowles wrote about it in his one of his blog posts on 1983, and he said, 40 years. There's something about 40 years, and 1983 and 2023, like it's kind of like in a similar way, this interesting period of change, and it got me thinking about that. And I know you pointed out the numerology or the symbolic aspects around the number 42, which is how long Elvis lived, but it had some deeper meaning behind it, right? Did we touch on that yet?
Well, 42, it definitely has a lot of meaning in occultism. I go in the book, but again, I try to stick to Egyptian Hermetic. I'm the Gnostic guy, so that's where I'm going to go. But there's definitely a lot to that. And yeah, I mean, I'm starting to realize David Bowie was just Elvis 2.0. I mean, and again, nothing I'm saying is sensationalistic. This is from the mouth of David Bowie. David Bowie's hero was always Elvis. And suddenly, then you start realizing, well, it makes perfect sense. I mean, although David Bowie flipped it, he started out with the jumpsuits and the makeup and all that, like Elvis became. And then he went into sort of the crooner stage in the 80s, if you remember. So he did flip it, but everything about David Bowie is just Elvis redivivus. I mean, even his last album was called Black Star. And then suddenly you realize, you find out Elvis sang a song called Black Star about death. And you start seeing all these little hints coming around this connection. And Elvis, again, obsessed with science fiction. Stanley Kubrick was his favorite director, 2001. He had extraterrestrials encountered. You start realizing Elvis was really a sci-fi guy and a star guy into astrology, and he could leave his body just as David Bowie. Did you know that the song Golden Years that David Bowie sang?
No.
Okay. Well, that was one of Bowie's biggest hits in the 70s. He wrote it for Elvis. And one of the stories goes is like he wrote it, is like, this is perfect for Elvis, because it's kind of a club, kind of a crooner song. But he was too shy to go to Elvis. So he had his wife, Angela, say, can you take this song for Elvis? And Angela got cold feet too, because they were both so gaga about Elvis. But then in 1977, 6 months before Elvis died, Elvis reached out to David Bowie and asked him to produce his next album. Imagine what an album that would have been.
Wow.
But unfortunately, one story ended. But I think David Bowie would have instinctually found what made Elvis Elvis and rebooted it. And we would have seen in the late 70s a completely upgraded, rebooted Elvis Presley with David Bowie's help. So,
well, who knows? Maybe Elvis did help out with some of David Bowie's production. There was that UFO sighting over David Bowie's concert that one time, and maybe Elvis was in the spaceship. There certainly has been some sightings that would lead you to think that. But before we get into the sci-fi aspects of Elvis's intrigue, you mentioned Black Star, and that made me think of Tupelo again, because I found out that Tupelo, that comes from the name of a tree that grows in the area, and that tree is locally known as black gum tree. So you could say that Elvis was born in Black Gum, Mississippi, in one sense of the meaning, right? So there adds a little bit of alchemy implied, and as you pointed out, he said it himself. He had hell and heaven on his side, and I think there's like a yin yang, at least, that comes to mind for me. But when it comes to
Taoism too, yeah.
Well,
he knew about the Nag Hammadi library. I mean, you name it, he knew it.
Right, and there are so many interesting avenues to go down. You mentioned that Elvis had one of the first black belts in America. There were only like 100 people at the time who had a black belt in karate when he did, and he kind of popularized martial arts before, people
in a country of 170 million at the time. So that is 100 black belts.
Well, and oftentimes Bruce Lee and maybe others get tons of credit for popularizing martial arts, but you point out that Elvis kind of does this, and martial arts has this shamanistic, spiritual background to it, very much connected to Taoism with Eastern martial arts, and yeah, it's fascinating. I just had an Irish catch wrestler on the podcast, and a lot of what he was talking about had, in my mind at least, Taoist similarities, the things that the Celts and the Druids would philosophize about. But it's interesting. I forget what we were just touching on, but another thing you mentioned about Elvis's interest was he read Urantia, which I happen to have that in the book heap behind me, and it's quite a mind-boggling read. It reads like sci-fi, but it was written sometime in the 1800s. I think it was probably even before Jules Verne, so you have to wonder, how they were contemplating nebulas and this whole galactic federation of alien civilization and throwing it all in there with the Bible. I mean, it's really a crazy read. What did Elvis say, what he thought about this book, or just that he was reading it?
No, he read Urantia, he read the Book of Enoch, he read Chariots of the Gods, von Daniken. So he was open about the ancient astronaut theory. He had no problem with that, but he kept other theories, the theory that the aliens are working with the government, the theory that they're stopping governments from nuking each other. He kept an open mind about it. He had 3 or 4 UFO experiences, personal ones. Again, this is all corroborated. He was never alone. He was there. There were times when I remember, and I don't know if he was trying to, he was a big trickster. He would be what we call today a shit poster. I mean, he was always playing tricks and jokes, and he told so we don't know, but he told one time a girl, he's like, I'm from one of the moons of Jupiter, and he described it, and he said, I am not of this world. But then again, in all earnestly, he told one time an actress he was working with, I am not of this world. So you don't know if he meant I'm an alien or more like the Gospel of John Buddhist, like my soul belongs somewhere. But he was open to all these ideas, and he just kept reading and trying to find answers, because he thought he was a seeker. Well, again, he lost his twin. He became the planet's most famous person, but he was like, so what is my role? And he thought, my role is hopefully to wake up others, listen to God, and he'll have more for me to help others. And he thought he was part of this group, these wise people like Jesus and Buddha. He bought into the whole ascended masters white brotherhood thing and the Freemasons. So he really thought he was part of something that would make a better world and help others wake up to their potential.
Yeah, you mentioned his collar. When he started sporting the high collar, it kind of had this hidden meaning. He got it from seeing this with spiritual masters who more often than not had this type of style to their clothing, which I find that fascinating. And then another interesting point about Elvis is when it comes to his UFO encounters, it seems like he had more than one, right? I mean, there was the odd light, the blue light, which he did meditate and visualize blue. But tell us about his UFO encounters, because this was a fascination that he kind of got a firsthand witness of.
Yeah, he had two mystical experiences. Again, in this day and age, the lines blur between extraterrestrial and angelic visitors. But let's stick to the traditional UFO encounters that were corroborated that he wasn't alone. There may be 4 now that I think about it, but then there's many that people have written about beyond that. But one was the classic. He was driving. There was a time when he didn't like flying, so he would drive from Memphis to Hollywood if he needed to do a movie. And he was driving, and he would get these giant luxury vans or, homes, whatever you call it. And he would drive, and in the Arizona desert, they all saw these discs moving around and doing that. And he and his body, they all freaked out, went outside to look. And then they had this big argument about what was it, things that we talk about today, he was talking about in the early 60s. Well, what if it was government equipment? Well, I ain't never seen government equipment go by. Well, what if these aliens attack us and destroy Earth? No, they're working with five, Southerners are arguing about UFOs like we would do today. And then Elvis is like, it's all gonna, he ends it. It's all gonna work out. I know these guys. We can trust them. That was one. The other one was and I think it's Palm Springs or L.A. home. He was outside with his bodyguard, and suddenly this light flooded the area. At first, they both thought, it's an helicopter or airplane, and then suddenly they're like, this thing's not making a sound, and it's flooding everything. So they freaked out. Elvis said, go in and get the rest of the gang, the bodyguards. He went in, his friend went in, and when he came out, Elvis was gone. The lights all over the place, and they're like, oh shit, he just got abducted. And so they're running around the neighborhood, and finally they see Elvis like 3 houses down on his neighbor's driveway, just chilling out, looking at the sky, and they're like, what happened? Well, we saw the UFO leave, and Elvis was like, oh well. The third one was actually at Graceland with his father and with Larry Geller. Again, lights came out, saucers, all that. They freaked out, and then his father said, oh, this reminds me of the blue light when you were born. And suddenly Elvis was freaking out because I was like, well, am I an alien? What's going on? And yeah, blue light became part of his, whenever he would heal people or do magic, it was always blue light. When you start looking at his songs and everything else, you realize blue appears everywhere.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. I wonder too, you mentioned the Philip K. Dick connection, if that played into it at all, because, like attracts like. He's this supercharged person who, as you mentioned as well, had the ability to change the weather, right? I mean, he had some strong abilities with his mental capacities. Maybe he attracted these otherworldly beings, or I mean, if they're government craft, I mean, that implies a whole nother level of it, and I wouldn't doubt that they would want to keep their eyes on Elvis for a number of reasons. But yeah, can we get into the similarities between Philip K. Dick and Elvis, aside from the twin situation which we covered? Were there any other similarities between the two?
Well, yeah. I mean, obviously, the twin thing was a huge one. Again, it was different because Elvis became, he did that lethal enmeshment with his mother, which also destroyed his psyche because suddenly when she died, all he could care about was being with somebody that reminded him of his mother. And that's why he got into H.P. Blavatsky, because he was like, oh my God, she looks like my mother. People always wonder, well, what the hell's wrong with Elvis? He was 24 and Priscilla was 14. Why is he being attracted to a young girl? Because she looked like his mother. That's the only thing that he could see when he would meet women was, are you my mother? With Philip K. Dick, it was the opposite. He hated his mother because Philip blamed his mother for the death of his sister because she didn't want to. Unlike Gladys, they didn't want to have it at the hospital. They were kind of hippies, or they were more holistic people, and he thought that was a terrible mistake. So, but as far as other similarities, again, one of the similarities is both were very Gnostically inclined. Obviously, Elvis because of Yogananda. He believed that the world was an illusion. He was really into the Gospel of Thomas and the sort of Christ's divine spark within us. So was Philip K. Dick. Both were very syncretic. They were never educated or really belonged to any organization. They just threw all this occult stuff together and came up with their own ideas that were very similar. Both had very similar mystic experience. Both had several extraterrestrial experiences, but the one that is striking is the mystic experience. What people mostly know about Dick's 374 encounter and the pink beams, and he saw the veil and all that. But there was one he had in the 60s, around the same time Elvis had it, where he was walking around and the sky broke open and he saw this metallic figure looking up at the sky down at him. And this figure was just like snarling at him, basically telling him, you're nothing. I am the ruler of this universe. And Philip K. Dick freaked out. Later, he kind of dismissed it. It was like, oh, I took too much drugs or I was projecting, whatever. But he basically had a Gnostic experience where he realized, because he was like, this is God. God is just telling me I'm in control and I'm evil. Elvis had a similar experience in the desert. He was driving again to Hollywood, and suddenly he saw these clouds come about, and he ran outside, and this time it was the face of Stalin. And Stalin was doing the same thing. I am the rule, I'm in control of this. Evil controls this universe. And Elvis, he had a different reaction. He's like, okay, kill me. Elvis is kind of a cowboy. Kill me, motherfucker. I'm going to trust in Jesus. But these two experiences are very similar to them. And I go through others. For example, both had this terrible weakness that you see with baby boomers and the silent generation. I'm sure you do it. You've known it with your family, and that it's street drugs are bad, but whatever the doctor prescribes is good. And that was both of their doom. They got hooked on amphetamines and other types of drugs because they had this huge blind spot that they just could not shake, which made no sense. But that was another thing that contributed to their doom. Both had terrible relationships with women for various reasons. Both ended up in the hospital or rehab because of their problems. Both were obsessed with science fiction. And again, as I mentioned, similar types of theology, and their worldview was there. I guess the opposite was like Elvis believed in innovating technology. Again, he took complete advantage of television, the jukebox, all these things that were part of his fame. And even later, he always was interested in technology and how it could help humanity. Obviously, Philip K. Dick was the opposite, always warning us that technology is going to destroy us in the end. So that's where they're separated. So there's probably about 10 more similarities, but it's strange because of all people, you would say those two. And again, both died too young, way young. Both predicted their death. I go blow by blow, how both left all these, both were saying to the world, I'm going to die early. And they left plenty of evidence and wrote it down and so forth and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah. When you mentioned the faith in the doctors over,
the drill,
psychedelics and whatnot. Yeah, I know the drill for sure. But it brought to mind a book I recently learned about, and I don't know how old this book is, but it's about Dr. Feelgood. Have you heard of Dr. Feelgood, the doctor that was basically JFK's kind of like personal doctor who was dosing him?
I know JFK was basically a cripple too.
Right. Right, and one of the things that I learned about recently through this book, and I don't have it in front of me, so who knows what the sources are, but it's really compelling stuff that JFK was basically being injected by this doctor with methamphetamines, and at the time, I don't know if that was even Schedule anything. It wasn't an illegal substance until maybe a couple of years later. Definitely was illegal by the time Elvis was passing, but by then they had all sorts of other pharmaceuticals, different ones like I forget the name of it, but it's penzanine or penzitol, something like that. The Nazis developed it, and Dr. Feelgood was a part of this project, and not through his own will. The Nazis kind of stole his work, and he left for America. But then, became a drug dealer or doctor for the celebrities and even JFK. So I'm curious if Elvis ever got in league with him. Was it the colonel that was supplying him with drugs? Because that's what the boomers say, right? Is that his agents were giving him drugs?
He got into amphetamines in the late 50s while in the army, because again, he was in the army. He did become a sergeant, but he still had his like celebrity life. So he was always under a lot of stress. Same with Philip K. Dick. Again, that's another similarity. Both were they were workaholics, and they ended up self-medicating for things. But later on, he had a private physician, and it was just a disaster because he had so many health problems. He had problems sleeping, but he needed more energy. I don't know. In my days of drug abuse, it was always like, oh, I'm too high. I need to come down. Oh, I got to be here, and you end up in this deadly cycle. Philip K. Dick was more like he lived in California and the pharmacists would write him whatever the hell he wanted. It was just a different era, but both got themselves in a really terrible cycle of pharmaceutical addiction. And yeah, amphetamines or anything that gave them energy was certainly part of the thing that you might say cut their life short.
Hmm. And I did just find that book. It's Dr. Feelgood, the story of the doctor who influenced history by treating and drugging prominent figures, including President Kennedy, Marilyn Monroe, and Elvis Presley. So look
I
at
like
that.
to read that, yeah, because my book deals with his. It has a Greek name that was his personal physician, but I
Yeah,
didn't.
well, I didn't know that. I'm not like trying to put you on the spot here. It's all just coming together synchronistically. But yeah, Richard A. Lertzman is the author alongside William J. Burns for anybody who wants to check that out. But I'll send you a copy of this, the PDF. I have it here. It doesn't say. Oh, Dr. Max Jacobson. That's the guy's name.
Uh-huh.
So, anyways, yeah, a little side tangent there, but yeah, that's a big part of the conspiracy. And a lot of times with celebrities, it seems like, especially musicians, there are forces around them that lead them to do drugs, put them in risky situations. And, every case is different, but it seems more often than not that musicians are worth more to the people around them dead than alive, right? Because of the royalties and all the other things that go when the person who's entitled to this stuff is passed away, right? So did any of that play into his passing? Because you talk about his death being ritualistic, but it seems more like Elvis was in control of his passing the way you phrased it.
Yeah, he was. I mean, I go in detail how his death was a ritual.
Mm.
And he left so many hints. He told so many people, and the way he was dressed and he acted was certainly it was all just this ritual. Even dying on the crapper, that's the throne, and people forget the only place that Elvis ever had any privacy in his life was really in the bathroom. And his bathroom was a place where he would bring like Larry Geller or friends where they could actually meditate and read spiritual books in peace or do some magical practice. So, and the last book he read was a book called Searching for the Face of Jesus. So his last book was about him encountering Jesus. So I go through all the details, how it was, but yeah, he was in control. He was doomed. I think there was and he knew he was doomed. I mean, there is something that happens in a lot of cultures where the shaman becomes addicted to drugs because he's working so hard and his body and his psyche start to break down because he's always dealing in the spirit world. And so he starts doing more drugs and eventually he just collapses. And this is very common, especially in the polar shamans, Antarctica, the Inuit, and other traditions. So, blow by blow, that's what he did. And there's also a very important aspect of shamanism called the wounded healer. The person who has the ability of the shaman is a person that's already broken from a childhood. Like you said, the tornado trauma, the poverty, losing his twin, dad in jail, losing his mother when he was still, not even, I think it was 21. All these things broke him. And coming from a family that already had a second sight, I think his mother was probably bipolar, and I think Elvis was. So Elvis was a wounded healer who had the ability to use magic. And so that all made he was in control. He was the shaman, and I don't think there was any other way. It's just he was always in control.
Right. Right. And of course, with his passing came all of the alleged conspiracies about his, faking of his death, even down to his death certificate seeming to have his own handwriting on it. I mean,
That's the freakiest one.
well, and
That
could that be more evidence to your point about it being a ritual, knowing that he was going to die? He signed his own death certificate ahead of time. I mean, is that
wouldn't be
possible?
surprised. But
Yeah.
that's the one thing that makes me jump up because there are, several experts on handwriting who are like, yeah, this is Elvis. It's very
Wow.
possible it was Elvis.
Wow. Wow. Yeah.
That's it. The rest, take it with a grain of salt, as I would. I don't think they fly. I really do think he left, but there's so many, strange ones,
Right.
so many conspiracies, but none of them really pass the muster as far as I'm concerned.
Well, and as you pointed out, the Graceland website has an entire, culmination or collection of alleged sightings. So people who want to hear that, they could go and check that out. Maybe I'll talk about that in the extended outro. But when it comes to Elvis Presley, as far as being, this trailblazer, he's not the first celebrity to die young, but he's definitely the first celebrity to have this string of conspiracies about him. Do you think that's due to him entertaining conspiracies while he was alive, or do you think that was just the flavor of the 70s and it kind of built up through the fandom and just this egregor that he created?
I'd say the latter. I
Yeah.
think he was, again, America's magician. He was this country shaman. It was a day after he died, 80,000 people showed up at Graceland. Jimmy Carter talked about heads of state showed up at his funeral. I mean, you don't understand. Nobody gets that. Again, if Taylor Swift died, that wouldn't happen tomorrow. I don't want to, God forbid, but or anybody else. If Dwayne Johnson died, he would not get that treatment. It was just like, it's unheard of. And it won't happen again in this history. And the sightings happen, the weird, strange things happened around and in Graceland and all this other stuff. But I don't think it was just. What was your question? I'm thinking of Graceland.
Well,
because I just got.
as you said that, I wonder, if there are any ghost sightings at Graceland of Elvis. But I was just sort of making a point about how Elvis was, the first of many celebrities to get this kind of conspiracy rap, and I'm just wondering, what's your thoughts on if that was,
Sure.
what
I
that.
mean, let's think about it. Obviously, James Dean, there were
Right.
some conspiracy. Marilyn Monroe, there was some conspiracy. There still are. Those haven't ended. But Elvis, it was just a gigantic, it was again a whole cottage industry of
Right.
specials, documentaries, books, articles. Even today, there's still books coming out on how he possibly died. It's like never before I've seen. I mean, yeah, the only other individual that comes close might be, JFK, as far as I know. Before that, I don't know, King Arthur, Jesus Christ. I mean, what did somebody say? Jesus was history's first murder mystery dinner.
Wow.
But yeah, it's like nothing you've seen. And again, the tabloids, everything. I mean, people talk about it in movies. It just never ended. And yeah, there are other I mean, Jim Morrison, he had a lot of attention after his death. People thought he faked it just to go live in Africa. But the size of Elvis, there's never been anything like it. And the shock to the nation, to the psyche of the world.
Well, and tell us a little bit about some of his trickster antics, because if you put it in line with that, it might not be so far-fetched that he would pull this kind of massive and final prank.
Yeah. Well, by now he'd be like 82. I don't know. What's the point of coming out, right? I'm
Right.
alive. I don't have teeth. Uh, no, I mean, he definitely, as I go in the book, he embodies, I have a huge breakdown of the trickster archetype, and Elvis falls into it. I mean, again, in native cultures, there's this being called the changer. Some call him the moon, some the coyote, the beaver, and this being comes from somewhere else, and he's going to change you. And there's nothing you can do. You can fight him, you can try to kill him, whatever. The more you fight him, the more he will change your body or your surroundings. He's going to throw your world upside down. That's what the trickster does, and that's what Elvis does. And the trickster is always a helper of humanity, but he also comes at a price. He always exists in the liminal places, and he's always somewhat amoral. And he's always a bringer of new art and new education and new forms of thinking to those he changes over and over again. Elvis certainly falls under, you might say, the trickster category. When viewed from that lens, there's many lenses I propose. Again, the American egregor lens, the trickster lens, the shaman lens, the magician lens, and whatever the reader wants to take, because at the end of the day, we can come up with all these labels. I keep going back to just Elvis Presley. There's nothing, nobody like him. There isn't.
Right, right. Yeah, no, he was certainly a phenomenon for someone who never traveled, right? I mean, he traveled obviously around the United States and a little bit in Canada, but he never went and did like a world tour, but he's beloved around the world.
Yeah, he went to Canada, I think, a couple of times. But yeah, he obviously was stationed in Germany while in the
Right,
army,
right.
but he was pretty constrained. I mean, it's not like he could do what he wanted to do. But yeah, he always wanted to tour the world, but I think he didn't do it because I know it sounds strange, but two things that Elvis always needed. One was his pills, and the other was his guns. He didn't, even though he had four black belts, and people had seen him do stuff with his feet that were just lethal. In fact, there were times when he took people down like effortlessly. When I was at Graceland, they showed me the chandelier that was 8 feet tall with broken chains, and the lady was like, "Oh, Elvis did that and found it amusing." But he was always armed to the teeth. So I don't think so unless these countries were going to allow him in his private jet to do all the things. I mean, even when he went to visit Nixon and he went to visit J. Edgar Hoover, the Secret Service forgot they took out is like one of those movies like The Matrix where oh God, where it's just putting guns on the table. They forgot his like ankle holsters, and he's like, haha, you forgot. Nixon's like, oh, don't shoot me in the Oval Office. Don't shoot me. So I think that's it. He was always armed, whether he was high or sober.
Wow. Yeah, and you mentioned that he had a DAA or DEA badge that he got through Nixon. Is charmed Nixon into getting him an honorary DEA badge. What do you think was behind that? Do you think it was just to add to his collection, or do you think that he was trying to use that maybe to get across the border?
That's what Priscilla thought. Priscilla thought it was all a stunt. Again, for your listeners who might not know, he got in a fight with his father about money because he was always spending. I mean, he would buy like fleets of motorcycles for friends, or you know what I mean? He just didn't care. And so he flew the coop. He left Graceland and nobody knew where he was. And people saw him. He got a friend in LA and he was on a passenger side. And then he shows up at the White House with a note. He gets it. The note gets to some aides. The note gets to Nixon, and in a day or two, he's meeting with Nixon again. No celebrity would be able to get away on a 2 day notice or a day notice to see the president of the United States. No, only Elvis could have done it because he was bigger than Nixon. Or as somebody said, in those days, the two most isolated people in the world were Elvis Presley and Richard Nixon in 1970. So they kind of had in common. So Elvis, there's a movie I think called Elvis and Nixon, and it's pretty fun if you get a chance to watch it because it does show what they talked and what they did. But Elvis had an obsession with badges, and Priscilla thinks that the one badge he wanted was the DEA badge because if you have a DEA badge, you can leave and come into the United States with drugs or guns, no questions asked. And that's what Elvis wanted. He didn't want to be bothered. He was the king. He just wanted to do, even the president of the United States can't walk around with drugs and guns. He wanted to be the top guy. And it was honorary, and then he sort of let it go. But he was collecting badges. But as I say, I think a lot of it has to do with control because his father had been put in jail. He lived under such poverty. He lived in a very unfair society. I mean, one time he almost got killed because he dated a black girl in Mississippi. You know what I mean? He felt that the badge was a symbol of freedom. Like nobody would mess with him or his family. He didn't have to be this poor white trash anymore. In fact, the clue is because He went for that badge on the night he got in a fight with his father.
Mm.
The authority figure hit him. He got angry and he wanted to prove to his father, I'm in control. Nobody's going to touch us. We're going to be fine. So psychologically, that's my theory. Again, Priscilla thinks it's because he wanted the drugs and the guns.
Yeah, well, and he also seemed to like to play cop. You know, he played the role of like civilian law enforcement, jumping in and traffic incidents and directing traffic throughout Memphis. Right? He just kind of liked to get out and do stuff like that and be in the
Yeah,
public eye as a hero.
yeah. He doubled as a cop or a secret agent. I mean,
Right.
there was like one story. Yeah, you mentioned he would direct traffic. He would, if somebody was speeding, he would stop them and write them an autograph and say, "Hey, man, just don't speed." And one time, the DA said, "You can come with us on a drug bust," but he took forever to get dressed. He had to get a mask. He had to get a top hat, a long coat. He had like a fake cigar because he didn't want people to know him. His bodyguards are laughing. He gets to the scene of the crime. They've already arrested all the drug dealers. He goes to the police station in costume, and all the cops are like, but he didn't care. Or there was a one time, is my favorite one, is that he was in Vegas and one of his employees stole from him like $20,000 in his jewelry. So Ellis finds out, and he and the Memphis Mafia go to the Vegas airport. And they show up, and then Elvis like, "All right, everybody spread out. Let's find him." He goes to the gate where the guy is, and the plane is leaving. And Elvis is like, "Ugh." Elvis goes out into the tarmac and puts out one of his badges to the pilot in front of the plane. And the pilot's like, "Oh my God, what the?" Elvis Presley's in the tarmac waving me down. So the pilot stops, lets Elvis in, and Elvis gets the wrong plane. It was in the wrong plane.
Oh
But then he
man.
finds the guy, eventually finds the guy. And there's two stories. One, he's like, the public story is he scolded the guy, got his money, guy fired him. And the other one is the guy started crying about money, and Elvis got really emotional because he remembered being poor and is like, "Well, why didn't you just ask? I would write you a check. I write big checks to anybody who asks." And Elvis started crying, and they hugged, and he rehired the guy that stole from him. So he had a really big heart. He was a wonderful person. But think about this. Do you think if, again, Dwayne Johnson or Arnold Schwarzenegger or Leonardo DiCaprio went out and stopped a plane, what do you think would happen to them today? They'd be arrested on the spot.
Right.
Social
Well,
media would lambast them. I mean, it would be a hellstorm. With Elvis, it was like, it's just Elvis,
yeah.
He broke federal laws by doing that, and stopped a plane from even back then you couldn't do these things. There was one time he got taken in. He showed up to go on a plane, a commercial plane, and he's like, "Can you just bill it to Elvis?" And she's like, "Okay." And she's asking the standard questions. "Well, do you have this and do you have that?" And he's like, "Yeah." And he's got all these guns. So the lady's like, "I gotta call airport security." Even before TSA, this was serious stuff. So they take him back, and they're like, "Elvis." He's like, "Well, what if I write you guys a couple of autographs?" And they're like, "Okay." So they write him autographs, and they let him on the plane just armed to the teeth. Again, nothing, nobody could do this today. It's like he was on this magical world that you and I could only imagine. He could do things that are just both magical. Like I said, if he was out and they were like the weather, it was in Hawaii and it was cloudy, he would do this, and he could part clouds, and he would do that all the time, stop rain. I mean, he was on a level of his own, Mark.
Wow, yeah, and I mean Hawaii, that's a whole nother dimension to it all. He wrote songs that kind of took people to that kind of holiday in their mind, as a big part of American culture back then, the vacation, right? So I'm sure he played a part in that. But it's interesting to hear you speak of him as such a kind person. I almost expected that not to be the case, just out of the sheer fact that he's a celebrity, and that tends to be the case. But it is, with Elvis, the case that he was very kind and generous. juxtapose that with this Memphis mafia that surrounded him. What was that all about? I mean, was he like a merry band, like Peter Pan and his, kind of, misfit crew, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor? Is that kind of the motif with this Memphis mafia? Who were they?
Well, there were friends and family and people he that were with him in the army, and he just hired them. That's
Right.
normal. You see NBA players will hire their neighborhood and give them jobs. And again, all these people grew up with him in dirt, in terrible poverty. There were blue collar people who survived the Great Depression, and they became his entourage, right? He became their cult leader. I mean, it wasn't easy. Like they say, when Elvis slept, they slept. When he was awake, they were whatever Elvis asked for had to be done. But he did take good care of them. He brought them out of poverty. They had very good lives, and they were in charge of everything. And it was a big entourage. And yeah, that was really it. It was just his inner circle of friends and family who did things for him. And
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Maybe the word mafia has a
it was just an
darker
endearing.
connotation in my mind, but yeah, no, that
He
makes
did
sense.
rub shoulders with mobsters while he was in Vegas, but it was Vegas. It's
Right,
just
right. Evidently, yeah, that would be the case, especially back then. Now, when it comes to the weirdest sort of stuff, are there any Elvis Sasquatch, Elvis Portal, Elvis anything beyond the UFO, like weird conspiracies, verified or not? Anything that kind of is worth noting about Elvis? Anything strange? There is the weather changing ability, which is really it's a shamanistic thing, if anything, but definitely mystical. Is there anything aside from that that stands out?
oh my God, there's so much. I mean, I go through all the different conspiracy theories. I go through between 10 and 20 sightings. And of course, there's hundreds, there's thousands of them. I go through all his magical, yeah, abilities, healing, out of body experiences, mystical things. I mean, there's so much. And again, I tie it to shamanism. For example, Elvis was obsessed, again, heaven and hell, the crossroads. He was obsessed with birth and death, completely obsessed with it. I mean, he, there was one time he went to the hospital with a friend, and this young mother came in and she was in labor and she was in so much pain. And Elvis was like, hold on, honey. And he puts his hand and starts doing things. And suddenly her contractions feel great. She's happy. But then the doctors are like, we got to do delivery. And the young mom's like, come in, Elvis. And I was like, I finally get to see a birth. Remember, this is the 60s and 70s. Dudes were not allowed into the room in those days. And he's like, I want to go. And the doctors are like, no, no, you can't go. You can't go. But he loved birth, but he also was obsessed with death. I mean, he would go at night. One of his obsessions was going to cemeteries and going to morgues. He would go and hang out at morgues. There was somebody said a friend died and the guy was gonna fix the body, embalm it and all. And Elvis sat there and meticulous knew everything that was supposed to be done to this body. Again, the Egyptian thing. He knew how to prepare a body like a doctor. And there's stories of him going into mortuaries at night. There was one time he would, and again, it was always armed to the teeth and with the Memphis mind. One time he's with Priscilla and he's looking at bodies and wondering about bodies, they see this little baby that had died, and Priscilla cries. So Elvis and Priscilla sit there and just start praying and praying for the baby's soul and being very nice to this poor body of a dead baby. He was obsessed with death because that's what shamans do. They're always going into the portal of death and birth and reborn. And Elvis was no different than that. He loved the dualities, the crossroads of life and death.
Mm. Well, and isn't there a pyramid that's associated with him somewhere? Is it in Memphis or I mean
There is,
obviously
but I think that's after. I think that was built in the 80s. Yeah,
okay,
that's there was none like that when he was.
when he was alive. Now,
Yeah, unless no, yeah, it was the 80s or
wh-
90s.
where is Elvis buried? Is he buried at Graceland?
Yeah, yeah. I actually visited the grave, and the energy there was was incredible. I mean, and every time a woman would sit I watched for like half an hour. Every time a woman would stand over a grave, she would start crying, regardless of her age. It was just it's like a pillar of light coming in. And yeah,
Huh.
he's buried next to his brother, Aaron, and then his father and mother. When he first died, they put him in a cemetery, but of course, within a day, people are trying to grave rob his body.
Mm.
Shocking. So he had to be put back at Graceland. So that's where he is. It's something else, really.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. My mother's parents, when my grandfather was alive, went to Graceland, and my Pepe was impressed with the pink Cadillac. He sat inside of it. And my grandmother, who is still alive, she mentioned that she was impressed with the furniture was covered with fur everywhere, and the fact
Oh,
that
it's
he,
so God.
yeah, and he had four TVs like all next to each other, so you could watch like I don't know multiple things at once or the same thing on four screens. I mean, she thought that was impressive, but I think Elvis is really somebody that I didn't expect to be this rich in this kind of esoteric American occultism. It's something that I've recently, in the past few years, really come around to diving into and understanding that America is not this kind of secular or Christian nation. It's neither. It's a huge melting pot. I think people really don't take that word and understand it. They think race, culture, but mysticism and religion and occultism are deeply steeped in this melting pot that is America. And I mean, Memphis is right at the heart of it. I mean, really, it's the heart of America in many ways, especially the music of America. And yeah, Elvis, I mean, he's an icon and will be probably for hundreds of years. I mean, the way they talk about mythological figures now, you might imagine he could be talked about in 1,000 years. But on that note, are there any mythological, maybe like, I don't know if Orpheus is an example, but someone, I heard you call him like the Pied Piper, but are there any kind of mythological people, characters that you would compare Elvis to?
Yeah, I'd say Hermes.
Hermes,
Definitely a lot.
definitely.
Any trickster god. Orpheus is good. Dionysus. I mean, yeah, people forget Hermes was very sexual and sexy to women. Obviously, Dionysus, by the way, Elvis could. He almost one time did get torn apart by women because he said, "Who wants to come with me to the hotel during a concert?" And but yeah, he could awaken women's sexuality and passion and even mind. I mean, he really although he was terrible at relationships, he really loved being with women and working with them spiritually, meditation and other things. So
Yeah. Yeah, a lot to look up to in Elvis, a lot to look into as well. And yeah, somebody who has been, colored a certain way. I mean, rightly so as far as drugs go. I mean, I wouldn't recommend that on anyone, but there is the argument that that was kind of pushed on him. Obviously, doctors were, as you pointed out, an authority to many of that generation. Even the boomers, to a large extent, think that way. I mean, my family thinks I'm crazy just because I smoke pot, and then 2 years ago the government says it's okay, and now nobody cares. I mean, things certainly change, right? And yeah, I think Elvis is just fascinating. But on a different note altogether, I was really stunned to see you recently have Arthur Verse Lewis on Aeon Byte Radio, because his book, The Philosophy of Magic, was one of the early books I found at a young age, and it really just stuck with me. I think it was Arcana Press or Publishing. That's at least the copy I had. And it just, yeah, I mean, the thumbprints and the worn book, I mean, it's one of those books on my shelf that really you could tell I've beat it up. And I was surprised to see him there because, just in my own ignorance, sometimes I see a name like that and I just expect him to be some 19th century guy that's, but no, he's alive and well and still kicking it on Aeon Byte. And that was so cool to see that. And Elvis kind of plays in, of course, to this American egregor, but any thoughts on, Arthur versus Lewis's work? I mean, his was that book, Philosophy of Magic, was so influential to me, and I'm sure it was to you.
Yeah, yeah, no, he's put out some great books, and obviously he's a big friend of the Gnostics. He's, as you said in the show American Gnosis, he makes a very good case that Gnosticism is American as apple pie, or Elvis. Elvis was certainly very much a Gnostic, and he goes through the history of the, great thinkers, Emerson and Herman Melville, and all these others, and other great American writers and artists that shaped this country, and how our psyche is very, in a way, very Gnostic. So I don't know if he knows much about Elvis, but he's done great work. And I mean, my favorite book is was it The Return of the Inquisitions, where he talks about how totalitarianism and mind control really started with the church fathers in Christianity trying to oppress and reveal the Gnostics 2,000 years ago, and this got weaponized and taken. Obviously, as some of your listeners know, the Inquisition didn't start against Jews or women. It started against the Gnostics, the Cathars. Then it moved on as a weapon, and many of the totalitarian leaders, whether they were communists or Nazis, they knew of the tricks of the church fathers of mind control and all that. So, yeah, he does great work. He knows how to hit some great niches and bring out a lot of gems out for the reader.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad you mentioned that title of his, because it does connect into the Elvis theme of our conversation. Obviously, you pointed out how the evangelical Christian community pointed, they lashed out at Elvis because of his, degeneracy, which was,
Yeah.
so light in comparison. I mean, really, if we look at this now in hindsight, you could think of it as ushering in or kicking off this domino effect. So were they right to think Elvis was this bad influence?
They were right. He was bringing subversive shamanistic energies that were upending culture.
Right.
And again, scholars have said that Pentecostalism is just American shamanism, blow by blow, how it moves and everything else. And when, as I mentioned, Pentecostalism was playing with these sexual magic energies, no doubt about it. Elvis just took it to like 11, if you would. And they were right. America was changing. This was a new America. We were more open to music. We were more open to alternative spirituality, drugs, martial arts. That's the America that Elvis is, and I hope we could get back to this more open-minded, inclusive, innovative, and in a way goofy and extroverted America that we were.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and if history does work in cycles, we might have to go through some rough decades to get to another 60s, right? The swinging 60s. But yeah, it does seem like that might be the case. But either way, I really, really love your take on this subject, Miguel. I love the perspective you bring to a biography on someone like Elvis, and I don't know that the typical Elvis fan is going to necessarily love your book, but I think you're going to bring a lot of people to become Elvis fans who might not have necessarily, known that they liked Elvis. I certainly gave it a try. I listened to some Elvis today, and I found I forget if it was the harem something. It was like a desert theme.
Oh my God!
It was like a desert theme.
Bad movies. Oh my God! Yeah, yeah.
Well, I picked it because I saw the word Kismet in one of the. That was one of the songs, and it was a neat song. It was dated for sure, but I've still got to look through the Elvis archives and see what I really jive with. But yeah, this is a really fascinating topic. Now, the book is finished, but it's still in the works, right? So what are we thinking as far as when it will be available? Sometime next year, hopefully?
Yeah, I'd say in about a year or so. Yeah, because I turned everything in, and it's a big publisher. They're really going to push it. It's going to be in libraries and stores. They're going to take their time for sure. And there's still going to be some editing and stuff like that. So
Well, I really appreciate you letting us have sort of an early look into this subject. And yeah, I definitely would like to have you back on when I get my hands on the book and we can talk about this and more. Our friend Ronnie Pontiac has opened this whole window into American metaphysics, right? I mean, his book is like a compendium of history, and yeah, I think Elvis might fit into his next edition if he goes and makes like a since then and when he left off. But anyways,
Yeah, even Mitch Horowitz, he's did
right,
America, Occult America, all these,
right,
and I gave him so much shit about him last summer when we were hanging out. It's like, where's Elvis? Because he was the biggest Elvis fan, and he grew up without money, so he worked as a teenager, saved up to buy an Elvis concert. It was the dream come true, and a few days out before the concert, he died. So
wow.
Mitch is speaking of haunted and being the biggest Elvis fan. I'm like, well, didn't you? What happened? You haven't included Elvis in all your books. You're in all your art. He's like, guess we're ready now. And he
Yeah,
loved the book. I gave him a rough draft, and he was like, this is it. This is the Elvis. Because he's Mitch is always like, I'm the number one Elvis fan in the world, and I believe him.
right on. Well, I think he's one that will accept this book with open arms. I definitely look forward to it. And on that note, are there anything? Is there anything else in the works that you're looking to promote? Obviously, the Astronosis conference is something that you put on, an awesome
That
in-person
would be
get
nice.
together.
Yeah, that will be next summer. Yeah, right now it's just Gnostic stuff I'm sharing on the website, courses, books. Your listeners can go there. I do hope my next book, I want to, again, the world has also missed David Bowie. I realize there's a lot they've missed about Elvis 2.0. So I'm working on, well, I can't work on it because every time I start working on it, something bad happens to me. Seriously,
Hmm.
I like get a book and I'll get sick within an hour, or I'll start writing notes about David Bowie and I'll twist my knees. I'm like, Elvis and David have not given me the green light on this one.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna wait.
Yeah, I would honor that sign, or at least be take it as a warning. Yeah, that's strange. I had a similar thing happen with H.P. Lovecraft. Just out of nowhere, got this really weird fever, and it was on the
Yeah.
podcast. People can listen to that episode. I turned the camera off. I was like literally like falling over. I could hardly sit. I mean, it was awful. And no slight against the guest. It was a great guest, but just the subject matter put this
Yeah.
thing in my mind. But anyways, Miguel, it's always a pleasure having you on this show, and I'm a big fan of Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. So, folks, of course, go and check that out if you haven't already. I've been a guest on Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, I'm proud to say, so maybe check that episode out first. Of course, Arthur Verse Lewis was a guest. Check that episode out. And you've talked about Elvis. I don't know if this was on the Patreon feed or on the free feed, but you're on Recluse's podcast talking about Elvis as well. So there are other places people can go if they want to hear more Elvis until the book comes out. But until then, folks, thanks for tuning in and immerse yourself in the moment wherever you are in the now.